water molecule. That's important. Now, if you think about structure related to function, this is a general biological principle. For example, you wouldn't have a church in a supermarket because structurally it is not catering for that. When you look at, for example, your mouth, the buccal cavity is there so that food can be ingested. And then it's also equipped with teeth so that you can cut and tear and bite the food that is taken in. So again, structure is related to function. When you think of your fingers, without joints, they wouldn't be able to grasp things, structure related to function. So if we are going to look at the role of the water molecule, we must of necessity look at its structure. And when you look at the structure of water, if you notice, we have there that red ball, that represents your oxygen atom. And please note that this is a diagrammatic representation of the structure. So the red ball represents the oxygen. It's O for oxygen. And there you have your covalent bond. And that's going to link the oxygen atom to the hydrogen atom on this side and another on that side. So you have H2O, the molecule of water. But in addition to that, you will notice that the oxygen atom bears what we call a slightly negative charge. And that is represented by the symbol delta. So you have delta minus representing the slightly negative charge on the oxygen atom. And by the same token, if you notice, attached to the hydrogen atom, it's a delta positive or delta plus, which represents the slightly positive charge on the hydrogen atom. The fact is that opposites attract, so the positive, delta positive hydrogen atom will be attracted and bonding to the delta negative oxygen atom to form the covalent bond. Now, covalent bonds are actually made through the sharing of electrons. And I'm going to be showing you that in a while, but just note that the angle here is 104.5 degrees. Please make sure that you understand what we're speaking about, and you must be able to draw the structure of the water molecule. The way things are, the last exam, you were required to just, the students were required to just use answer multiple choice questions along with the SBA component. We are not sure what will pertain for your exams, so it's best to make sure that you prepare for any eventuality. Now, the water molecule is dipolar with partial charges on the atoms. The partial charges, as we saw in the diagram before, are represented by the Greek symbol delta negative for the oxygen atom and delta positive for the hydrogen atom. And of course, just to inform you before we move on, that the water molecules tend to stick together due to the weak hydrogen bonds that exist between them. Very importantly, you need to note that the atoms in water are held together because they share electrons with each other. And each shared pair of electrons forms a covalent bond. For example, in a water molecule, two hydrogen atoms each share an oxygen atom, forming a molecule with the formula H2O. And we saw that in the structure below, before. Now, the dipoles, hydrogen bonds, when you're drawing the structure of the water molecule, ensure that you attach your labels. So the O for the oxygen atom, the covalent bond is shown there, and the hydrogen atom. And we're going to look now at the dipoles and the hydrogen bonding in water, between water molecules. If you look at the diagram there, you can identify 1, 2, 3, 4 water molecules. And if you notice, between each water molecule, there are hydrogen bonds represented by broken lines. And that's because there's a force of attraction between the negatively charged oxygen atom and the positively charged hydrogen atom of another water molecule. So this water molecule has a force of attraction there with this second water molecule to form a hydrogen bond. And the same applies here. So usually each water molecule is attached to about 3 other water molecules with the weak hydrogen bonds. And even though these hydrogen bonds are weaker than the covalent bonds, they have a significant effect, which we must note. Now, this unequal distribution of charge is called a dipole, and this is a term that you must commit to memory. The meaning of a dipole, the unequal distribution of charge. Now in water, the negatively charged oxygen molecule is attracted to the positively charged hydrogens of another, and this attraction is called a hydrogen bond, or we say there's hydrogen bonding between the oxygen atom and the hydrogen atom. It is much weaker, as I said before, than a covalent bond, but it still has a very significant effect. Molecules which have groups with dipoles are said to be polar. Now, we're going to look next at how the structure of water, of the water molecule, relates to the properties of water. Now, the properties of water, very important in the scheme of things. Without water, I don't think life could exist on Earth as it does, because about 75% of the planet would be made up of water, which is often referred to as the universal solvent for polar substances. And polar substances are that dissolve readily in water. This property makes it suitable as a transport medium. And non-polar or uncharged substances may dissolve in water, but not as readily as polar substances. Now, water has a high specific heat capacity, and that is the second property that we're going to look at. This is so very important. What is the meaning of the term specific heat capacity? It is the amount of thermal energy, or heat energy if you will, that is required to increase the temperature of unit mass, 1 gram of water, by 1 degree Celsius. That's the specific heat capacity. And in the case of water, it's quite high, and we'll see why that is very important. The third property we're going to look at is that water has a high latent heat of vaporization. And this is the amount of thermal or heat energy required to change liquid water to water vapor. And you know, vaporization, formation of a vapor, and the heat that is required to do so. So I'm really going through the properties of water, and then we'll discuss how these relate to the functions. Now, I'm just seeing that this diagram, I really should have mentioned before how the whole business of solubility of ionic substances or polar substances in water occur. And if you have a look at the diagram there, on the macroscopic level, you'll see a beaker of water with an amount of sodium chloride, or common salt, if you will. Now, when the sodium chloride ionizes, it forms sodium or Na plus ions and Cl minus ions. And if you look here, you'll see this blue atom here with a positive charge, so it's a sodium ion. And notice that at the microscopic level, which of these atoms will be attracted to the sodium ion. It's a negatively charged oxygen ion, which has the delta negative there, so it's going to be attracted to the positive. And if you notice, the water molecules are turned towards the positive sodium ion, but with the oxygen this way, because it has a negative charge and positive attracts negative, whereas the hydrogen ions with the delta positive charges are turned away from the positive sodium ion. The reverse is true. This green chloride ion here would have, of course, the positively charged hydrogen ions turned towards it or being attracted to it because opposites attract. So if you're required to show on a microscopic level how the sodium chloride would dissolve in water, this is a diagram that you would perhaps use. It's very simple. You don't have to use colors. You simply use your pencil and you make sure that you label so that it is very clear. The positive ion here for sodium, the negative chloride ion, the water molecule, and then the partially positive delta positive shown there beside the hydrogen ion. So let's continue with the properties of water. The fourth property is that water has a high latent heat of fusion. And fusion is synonymous with the word melting. And it's the amount of thermal energy required to change ice to water. Fusion, melting, changing from ice to water, we say that the ice melts. Now, this is very important in the scheme of things because you're going to need a large amount of heat or thermal energy to change a small amount of ice to water. Fifth property is that water is highly reactive. Highly reactive, and it's able to split to form hydrogen ions, H+, and hydroxyl ions, OH-. And if you notice there, this is a reversible reaction, which shows really what happens, and it is in aqueous solution. Liquid water converted to H+ ions in solution, and OH- ions in solution. And that's very important in the scheme of things because we'll see when you get hopefully to unit 2 level, and we do photosynthesis and respiration in detail. Now, the next property, the density of solid water or ice is less than that of liquid water. And if I might show you here, if you should add water to the cubes of ice, I'm so sorry that it melted over time, but if you add water to the ice cubes, you notice that the ice is actually floating to the top. And this is so important. See, it's floating to the top because the ice, which is, even though it's a solid form of water, is less dense, and that is why it floats to the top. If you try to walk on water, you're going to sink because you are going to be more dense than the water in which you're trying to walk on. Only Jesus did that, I guess, and the Jesus lizard, which we'll talk about later. Moving right along, the final property, or 2 properties that we are going to speak to. Water exhibits high cohesion, and surface tension is also conferred due to the weak hydrogen bonds which hold the water molecules together. Water exhibits high cohesion. We say there are cohesive forces where the water molecules are attracted to each other and therefore form a skin on the surface of water and allows for certain functions to be performed. It leads us next to see the relationship between the properties of water and the functions of water in organisms and its role as a suitable environment for these aquatic dwelling organisms. So let us look in detail now at the relationship between the properties of water and the functions. Remember, we spoke of water as a universal solvent. Water is a very important and perhaps the main component within the cells of organisms. So the cytoplasm of cells would consist predominantly of water with dissolved substances as well as little structures called organelles suspended in them. Without water to form the cytoplasm, clearly cells would not be able to survive. In addition, water as a universal solvent allows it to perform the role of an excellent transport medium. So the transport media example, blood plasma, which is a liquid part of blood, is going to have dissolved substances such as glucose, amino acids, mineral salts, and in some cases nitrogenous wastes. And those substances are dissolved in the water that forms the plasma, the liquid part of blood, and are transported to the various parts of the body where it is required. We can look also at lymph, which is a kind of tissue fluid, and the role of water in the phloem and xylem vessels. Now, you might wonder how it is that water is able to pass through the body of tall trees, the oak tree, and even our own guango tree in Jamaica. You might wonder, how is it? Even in times of drought, they still look healthy and firm. And that's because of the role of water being able to pass through the very narrow xylem vessels, and as a result, take minerals from the growth medium through the roots, up the stems, to the leaves and the crown of the tree so that it is able to survive. In addition, water has gases such as oxygen and carbon dioxide dissolved in it. It's far more soluble, the carbon dioxide, than oxygen, but it is also very important in the scheme of things. Now, if we look next at the high specific heat capacity of water, it is higher than that of other common substances such as alcohol, and it takes 4.2 joules of energy to increase the temperature of 1 gram, that's unit mass of water, by 1 degree Celsius. And what this means, for example, it's very important in the scheme of things because you need far more energy, more heat energy, to change the temperature of water by 1 degree Celsius. Now, the thermal energy that we speak of, the heat energy, breaks the hydrogen bonds between the water molecules. And so the significance of this is that the high specific heat capacity allows for limits in the fluctuation of temperature of organisms and also of the environment in which they exist. When we speak of the next property, the high latent heat of vaporization. Now remember, we spoke of vaporization as a conversion from liquid water to vapor. That's understandable, but it requires heat energy. A relatively large amount of energy is needed to change small quantities of water to water vapor. What's the significance of this? Is that the loss of water for cooling organisms, example, sweating in animals and transpiration in plants, is quite efficient. So, for example, when you are out in the hot sun, you might find that you produce sweat. Now, it's not the production of sweat that cools your body. It's the evaporation of the sweat, the liquid water sweat, that will cause the body to cool down. Now, how is this done? The heat is going to be taken from the blood that's flowing through the body near the skin. And what it does is to cause the conversion of liquid water, the sweat, to vapor. And by using that heat from the blood, it's going to be cooler. The blood is going to get cooler because the heat is being used to evaporate the sweat. And as a result, cooler blood will be flowing through the body and will cool it down. So it's the evaporation of sweat that really brings about the cooling effect. And the same applies for transpiration in plants. You might see, for example, dogs panting. And when it's very hot, you know, they'll open the mouth and the tongue is elongated and they're panting. And that is also something that brings about a cooling effect in that animal. I might also add that this whole business of requiring a large amount of energy to change small quantities of water to water vapor has significance for what is happening in our country today. The fact that it has been raining for 3 weeks and not enough time or enough heat energy from the sun to dry out the water. So the soil gets so soft that we have all these landslides. That's because it requires a lot of heat energy to cause the water in small puddles, for example, to evaporate. So in this regard, it is almost like a disadvantage. But I want you to bear that in mind. The fact is, without the sun being out, then you're not going to have the water in the soil evaporating. Let's look now at the aspect, of the high latent heat of fusion. Much thermal energy is needed to change ice to liquid water. The same applies here. As a result, the water in cells tends to remain in the liquid state, and it prevents the cell membranes and the cell walls of the plant cells from being damaged by ice crystals. And so you'd find that the water in cells, the cytoplasm, tends to remain in the liquid state because of this high latent heat of fusion. Now, the reactivity of water molecules is also of great importance. If the water molecule was not reactive, then there would be no splitting of the water molecule to form hydrogen ions and electrons, which are needed to drive the all-important processes of photosynthesis and respiration. And I know you know from C-Sec biology that photosynthesis is the process by which plants produce their own food. And respiration is the energy-producing process in living organisms. Water is also important in the process of digestion, which involves the hydrolysis or breakdown of complex substances. Now, if you look at the word hydrolysis, hydro refers to water, lysis to split. So you split a molecule using water. Now, if, for example, you have cane sugar or sucrose, and you add water to the sucrose, you will not be getting glucose and fructose, because that is a physical reaction whereby no new substance is formed. So in order to add water to have a chemical change so that the sucrose molecule will be broken to produce its composite monosaccharides, glucose and fructose, you need to add it in the form of dilute hydrochloric acid. Now, dilute hydrochloric acid, remember, is really concentrated hydrochloric acid with water. So when you add the dilute hydrochloric acid, you're in effect adding water to the sucrose to break the molecules to produce the two monosaccharides, the composite glucose and fructose. And of course, glucose, you know, is also referred to as blood sugar, and fructose, fruit sugar. Now, water is an unusual substance. When we speak to the density, I think we had dealt with that before, but no problem in reiterating the fact that it's an unusual substance because the solid state ice is less dense than the liquid water, and we show that it's still floating on top. What's the significance of that? Below 4 degrees Celsius, the density of water decreases such that ice floats on liquid water and insulates the body of water under the layer of ice. And this has implications for aquatic animals that live in temperate countries. So during winter, what happens? What would be the result if the lakes and ponds froze over? Then all the animals would die, and that would be untenable. So in winter, what happens is that the water freezes over to form this layer of ice, which is an insulating layer, keeping the water below at a temperature that will sustain the lives of the aquatic organisms. Now, this reduces the density of water, of ice, reduces the tendency for large bodies of water to freeze completely, thus allowing aquatic animals to survive the hazards of winter in temperate countries. And finally, another important property is that changes in the density of water with temperature causes currents which help to maintain the circulation of nutrients in the ocean. Obviously, the aquatic animals are going to be needing their nutrients. high cohesion and surface tension, and I think this is the last property that you need to learn. Now, cohesion, remember, refers to the tendency of water molecules to stick to or be attracted to each other due to hydrogen bonds. And you can try this at home. If you take a coin and you place a drop of water on the coin, it tends to form a blob of water. Whereas if you do it with alcohol, it will simply spread out across the surface. The fact is, this demonstrates the attraction among the water molecules. This property is called cohesion. And it also confers another property, surface tension, whereby there's almost a skin that forms on the layer of the body of water and provides an excellent habitat for organisms like the pond skater and the Jesus lizard. Now, I'm not a lover of that reptile, so I did not use it. I used the pond skater. If you notice, it's sunken here, where the impact of the leg on the surface of the water, it's almost sunken to show that there's this kind of skin. And the pond skater is able to move across the body of water. Now, I have some questions for you before we close. And there's another little treat that I have. The type of bond. Number one, the type of bond which occurs between water molecules is called a or an covalent bond, a hydrogen bond, C, an ionic bond, or D, van der Waals force. Of course, the answer is B, hydrogen bond. That's the bond that occurs between or among water molecules. Remember, it couldn't be covalent bond because that's the bond between the oxygen and the hydrogen atoms. Next, question 2. Which statement best describes a property of water? A, water acts as a solvent for all nonpolar substances. At normal room temperature, water molecules are bound together by ionic bonds. C, a large amount of thermal energy is required to increase the temperature of 1 gram of water by 1 degree Celsius. And D, water is not very reactive and is unable to split to form ions. If you said C, you're so right. Applause for you, because water acts as a solvent for nonpolar substances. At normal room temperature, water molecules are bound together by hydrogen bonds, and D would be incorrect because water is highly reactive. Then we have question 3. The specific heat capacity of water is approximately, and the answer there is 4.182, because if you round off to the next tenth, it will be 4.2, which you might see in some texts. It's 4.182 joules per gram degree Celsius. And the final question, which property of water allows the insect, the pond skater, to move on the surface of a body of water without sinking? And we just discussed that. It is, of course, the high surface tension due to the cohesion of water molecules. Now, before we close, I sat in the waiting room and wrote a poem that I thought would encapsulate today's lesson. And perhaps it would be good if you tried to do the same thing too. Perhaps it would be good if you did a piece of dub poetry or did a video about this whole lesson on water and the importance of the water molecule. Now here goes. It's called Water, Water Everywhere. The structure of the simple water molecule will indicate that it is indeed a dipole with a slightly negative and slightly positive charge, making water a polar molecule at large. Between the oxygen atom and hydrogen atoms is a covalent bond, the sharing of electrons making the link quite strong, unlike the weaker hydrogen bonds you see found between water molecules, making for cohesion so free. Without water, chemical reactions would never occur, and its functions as a great solvent is really what it's for. Its specific heat capacity is 4.2 joules per gram degree Celsius, not to mention its high latent heat of vaporization, definitely a must. Water is highly reactive, splitting up to form hydrogen and hydroxyl ions, to drive the important processes like photosynthesis and respiration. And don't you forget that ice is less dense than liquid water, forming an icy insulating layer so water animals can live in winter. Cohesion and surface tension on bodies of water will form a skin so that the pond skater and Jesus lizard can step it up. That's the norm. So my children, here's hoping that you have learned all you can about the importance, properties, and functions to the environment, all organisms, and of course, to man. So, at this time, I want to encourage you to really study hard, do well, and make sure that you include all of your classmates. Remember that it's a team effort, it's not a competition, and we want to make sure that you all get through your exams and be successful, because ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, you know that success is a must. All right, so if we can quickly recap, remember now the introduction. In the introduction, we spoke about the importance of water. Without water, there's no life as it exists on Earth. The fact is that the structure of water is what drives its properties, the properties of solvent being an excellent or universal solvent, the fact that it has a high latent heat of vaporization, high specific heat capacity, high latent heat of fusion. It is highly reactive. The situation is that the solid water or ice is less dense than liquid water, and we discussed the significance of that. And in addition, there's this attraction among water molecules called cohesion that confers surface tension and allows for many of the aquatic organisms to be able to survive in the aquatic habitat. And finally, we have the functions as a solvent, the fact that the various properties will allow for water to function as an excellent, simple biological molecule. And I'm hoping here that you understand what we have learned, what you have been taught, and it's going to be a situation where I'll make sure that you have some questions that are available for you. And the past paper questions you may find, I'll perhaps leave them with the ministry so that you can access it. The questions that we did, if we can have a look at that, I'm not sure if you had a chance to take them down, but just bear in mind the type of bond which occurs between water molecules. Remember, that's a hydrogen bond. Then the property of water which allows the insect, the pond skater, to move on the surface of a body of water without sinking. Of course, it couldn't be associated with the high specific heat capacity of water. It couldn't be the property of water as an excellent solvent for polar molecules, and it could not be water as a liquid being less dense than ice. So it has to be the high surface tension due to the cohesion of water molecules. So B would be the answer for that. And we could have a look at the specific heat capacity of water, approximately 4.182 joules per gram degrees Celsius. It could not be 4,182 joules per gram degrees Celsius, nor could it be C or D. Now, that's the time, therefore, that we have for Cape Biology. You can watch back. You can recap today's lessons on onespotmedia.com and on JN between 4 p.m. and 7 p.m. Class time resumes tomorrow at 9:45 a.m. right here on TVJ. So until then, keep safe. Remember to wash your hands, sanitize, and wear your masks. I don't have my mask on because I'm teaching you. So you take care. Bless you, and all the very best. Success is a must.
It's here. Interactive classes for all ages on the School Time channel on onespotmedia.com. With a combination of live Zoom classes and recorded class time, Schools Not Out lessons, and numerous educational content, we've created a comprehensive 24-hour channel dedicated exclusively to educating our nation's youth. Early childhood through to primary, secondary and tertiary, it's one stop on one spot for education 24 hours. Brought to you by the Ministry of Education, Youth and Information in association with Television Jamaica Limited.